Get him out of here." Nobody laughed at first, they just stared. The young man standing at the entrance to the Hargrove auction house did not belong there, and everyone in the room understood that without needing to be told. His jacket was the wrong kind, canvas, not wool. The kind you buy at a hardware store because it keeps out wind, not because it signals anything. His boots had mud on them. Real mud from a real field, not the decorative kind that rich men sometimes affected to seem grounded. He held his cap in both hands, turning it slowly, the way a person turns something when they are nervous but trying not to show it. Reginald Hargrove did not move from his position at the center of the room. He simply turned to his assistant and said it again, quieter this time, which somehow made it worse. "Get him out." The assistant, a young man in a blue suit who had learned very quickly that his job was to anticipate the moods of his employer, started across the marble floor. The auction room was full that evening. Hargrove Fine Art and Estate Sales held its spring invitational every April, and the guest list was curated the way one curates a museum exhibit, carefully, deliberately, with a clear idea of what belonged and what did not. Collectors from Memphis and Nashville and Atlanta had driven in. A woman from Chicago who owned 3 galleries had flown. The chandeliers were lit. The catalog had been printed on heavy stock. The young man at the door saw the assistant coming and did not step back. "I'm here about the Callaway violin," he said. The room went quiet in that particular way, that rooms go quiet when something unexpected has entered them. The Callaway violin had a history that most of the people in that room knew only in the way they knew most things, partially, and through the version that flattered them. What they knew was this. It had been made in 1887 by a craftsman in New Orleans named Elias Soro, a free black man who had learned the trade from a French luthier, and then, by most accounts, exceeded him. Soro had made 11 instruments in his lifetime. 7 were confirmed to exist. The Callaway violin, named for the family that had owned it for 60 years, was considered by the people who knew such things to be the finest of the 7. It had a sound, they said, that was not like other sounds. Reginald Hargrove had acquired it from the Callaway estate 6 months earlier for a price he had not disclosed and had spent the intervening months building anticipation. Tonight it was the final lot of the evening, and the bidding floor had been set at $400,000. The young man at the door was named Isaiah Drum. He was 29 years old. He had driven 4 hours from a town in Mississippi, so that most of the people in that room had never heard of, and would not have been able to find on a map without help. He had $43 in his wallet. He had not eaten since morning. He said again calmly, "I'm here about the Callaway violin." The assistant reached him. "Sir, this is a private event. Invitation only, I understand that," Isaiah said. "I need to speak with whoever is handling the Callaway violin before it goes to auction." From across the room, Hargrove's voice cut through the ambient noise like something cold. "Young man, what business could you possibly have with that instrument?" Isaiah looked at him. He did not look away. "I can tell you it's a fake," he said. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture to it. Hargrove moved then, not quickly but with the deliberate, measured pace of a man who has learned that speed is for people who are uncertain. He was 61, silver-haired, built like a former athlete who had made peace with the years. He wore his wealth the way old money does, quietly in the quality of fabric, the particular shade of his watch face. He crossed the room and stopped 6 feet from Isaiah Drum, and looked at him the way a person looks at something they have already decided is not worth their full attention. "A fake," he repeated. "Yes, sir. And you are?" "Isaiah Drum." Hargrove waited for more. Isaiah did not provide more. "Mr. Drum." Hargrove's voice had the particular smoothness of a man who had never been seriously challenged in a professional setting. "This violin has been authenticated by 2 separate experts, both of whom hold doctoral degrees from institutions I suspect you could not name. It has been examined, catalogued, and verified. The provenance is documented back to 1902. So I am genuinely curious." He paused to allow the room to hear what was coming. "What qualification you imagine you possess that would allow you to walk into this room and make that claim?" Someone near the back of the room laughed. Not cruelly, exactly, but in the way people laugh when they are relieved that they are not the one being asked to answer. Isaiah kept his cap in his hands. He looked at the violin case on the display stand near the far wall, glass-topped, lit from below, the kind of presentation that told you a thing was important before you ever saw the thing itself. "May I look at it?" he asked. "Absolutely not." Hargrove said. Then I'd like to tell you what I know, and you can decide what to do with it. Hargrove studied him for a moment. There was something in the young man's stillness that was harder to dismiss than he wanted it to be. He had built a career on reading rooms and reading people, and something in this particular person was not reading the way it should. He made a small gesture with one hand, the kind that means, go ahead, and also means, this will be brief. Isaiah Drum said, Ilias Sorrow used a specific combination of hide glue and pine resin that he sourced from one supplier in New Orleans his entire career. The ratio changed after 1891 when that supplier closed. Every instrument he made before 1891 has a particular acoustic signature, a sustained resonance in the upper register that drops off sharply below 200 hertz. The Callaway violin is supposed to have been made in 1887. If it was, it will have that signature. If it doesn't, he paused, then it isn't what you think it is. The room was very quiet now. You can test it in 4 minutes, Isaiah said. All you need is a bow and something to measure the output. Hargrove did not call security. He told himself later, in the version of this story he rehearsed privately, that he had allowed it because he was not afraid. Because a man who has authenticated an instrument twice has nothing to prove. Because the young man's certainty was, if nothing else, worth disproving publicly so that the evening could proceed without this hanging over it. He told himself that. He mostly believed it. What he said out loud was, Phillips. His auction manager materialized from somewhere near the champagne table. Get the Bremer meter from the back office. There was murmuring. The woman from Chicago, whose name was Audra Fenn, and who had been in the business long enough to know when something interesting was happening, moved slightly closer. A collector named Beaumont Lale, who had driven up from Atlanta, set down his glass. The violin case was opened by a white-gloved handler. The instrument inside was old, visibly, demonstrably old, with the amber depth of varnish that only comes from decades. It was beautiful. Even Isaiah, standing 10 feet away, could see that it was beautiful. The handler lifted it with both hands. Hargrove looked at Isaiah. You'll need to play it, Isaiah said. I can, if you'll permit. No one is going to hand you that violin, Hargrove said. Then have your handler play it. Anything in the upper register. A scale, if nothing else. The handler, a woman named Cecile who had worked for Hargrove for 11 years and who had herself played violin for 9 years before that, looked at Hargrove. He gave a short nod. She played a scale. The room heard it. The room heard it the way a room full of people who are pretending not to be tense hears something. Collectly carefully, with the specific quality of attention that looks like casualness. Isaiah listened with his eyes half closed. Phillips returned with the measurement device. He set it up. He ran the reading. He handed the result to Hargrove, who looked at it for a long moment. Hargrove's face did not change, which was itself a kind of change. He looked at Isaiah Drum. How did you know? He asked, and the smoothness was gone from his voice. Just gone. What was underneath it was something rawer and more ordinary. Isaiah said, because I've seen the real one. His grandmother's name was Abigail Drum, and she had kept a secret for 31 years inside a cedar trunk under the bed in a house in Claiborne County, Mississippi, that had no air conditioning and a front porch that tilted 6 degrees to the left. She had not told Isaiah about it until the summer he was 14, and even then she had told him slowly, the way you tell a person something you have been carrying a long time, in pieces, with rest between them. What she told him was this. In 1971, a man named Harold Weston had come to Claiborne County with a violin case and a story. Harold Weston was the great-grandnephew of a woman who had been a domestic worker for the Callaway family in New Orleans in the 1920s. That woman, her name was Bessie, and no one in Isaiah's family knew her last name, had been given the violin by the youngest Callaway son in 1931, pressed into her hands on the day the family home went to creditors during the Depression. Take it, he had said. Take it, and don't let them have it too. Bessie had taken it. She had not known what it was worth. She had known it was old and that the man had wept when he handed it over, and she had wrapped it in a blanket and put it in the back of a closet, and later, when she moved, she had taken it with her. Harold Weston, who was her grandson, had brought it to Claiborne County because he was running out of places and running out of options, and he had heard, through the kind of network that exists among people who cannot afford lawyers and banks and formal institutions, that Abigail Drum was a woman who knew how to keep things safe. She had kept it safe for 31 years. She played it once, she told Isaiah. Just once, the night Harold brought it. It sounded like something that had been waiting, she said. Isaiah spent the next 8 years learning everything he could about Elias Sorrow. He was not a prodigy. He was not a musician. He was a person who had read everything there was to read and then kept reading, the way certain people do when a thing has taken hold of them and won't let go. He worked at a lumberyard. He took 2 online courses in acoustic measurement from a community college. He drove once to Nashville to look at a different sorrow instrument held in a university collection, and he stood in front of it for 40 minutes, and the curator, who was supervising, asked him twice if he had any questions, and he said no. And he stood there for 10 more minutes after that. He had known, when he saw Hargrove's catalog advertised online, that something was wrong. The provenance documentation was close but not right. The chain of ownership had a gap from 1931 to 1963 that was papered over with a letter that smelled, to someone who had been reading about this for 8 years, like it had been written more recently than it claimed. He had driven 4 hours. He had $43. He had not hesitated at the door. What happened next is the part that Reginald Hargrove would later describe to his attorney as a difficult evening, and that Audra Fenn would later describe to 3 separate colleagues as the most interesting thing I have seen in 22 years in this business. Hargrove did not cancel the auction. He postponed it 48 hours, which is a thing that does not happen, and the murmuring in the room reflected how much it does not happen. He arranged for a third authentication, this time from a specialist at a university in New Orleans, who had written her dissertation on Elias Sorrow's craft. He allowed Isaiah to be present for that examination, not out of generosity, but because Isaiah had suggested, quietly, that he might be useful. He was useful. The specialist, Dr. Tamsin Okafor, 44 years old, 20 years in her field, spent 90 minutes with the instrument. Isaiah sat in the corner of the examination room and did not speak unless he was asked a direct question. And when he was asked, he answered without elaborating, which Dr. Okafor later noted was a quality she had found, in her experience, to be rare and valuable. Her conclusion: the violin was not made by Elias Sorrow. It was made by someone who had studied Sorrow's methods closely and reproduced them with considerable skill. The work was probably from the 1960s. The varnish had been artificially aged. The hide-glue ratio was approximately correct, but not exactly correct, and the acoustic signature in the upper register was present but flattened, as if whoever had made it had known what to aim for, but had not quite understood why it mattered. A very sophisticated forgery, she said. She said it looking at Hargrove. Hargrove's face had been doing something difficult for 2 days by that point. He asked Isaiah, in a room that contained only the 2 of them and a third party, who had been invited to ensure nothing was misrepresented, where the real instrument was. Isaiah said, "It's safe? Can you prove it exists?" "Yes." "Will you?" Isaiah looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window, the April light was doing what April light does in Tennessee, coming in at a low angle, filling the dust with gold, making everything look a little more significant than it was. "That depends," Isaiah said, "on what you're planning to do about what you've learned." Hargrove was not a bad man. This is important to say, because the story is easier if he is, and he was not. He was a man who had built something over 30 years and had stopped questioning certain things because questioning them had started to feel like a threat to the structure. He had bought the violin from an estate dealer he trusted. He had commissioned the authentication because he was thorough. He had not known it was a forgery. What he had done, the thing that mattered, was assume, when a young black man in a canvas jacket and muddy boots walked into his auction room, that the young man was wrong before he had heard a word the young man said. He had let the room laugh. He had prepared internally the speech he would give when the test confirmed what he was already certain of. He sat with that for a while. He called Isaiah the next morning. "I'd like to understand what you want," he said. Isaiah said, "The violin belongs to a family. I'd like to help return it to them. If there's something you can do to make that easier, I'd appreciate it. And in terms of..." "That's what I want?" Isaiah said. "That's all I want." Which was not entirely true. There was one other thing, but Isaiah did not say it then. The cedar trunk was exactly where it had always been. Abigail Drum was 77 years old and had a way of moving through her kitchen that suggested she had mapped every square foot of it decades ago and saw no reason to revise the map. She made coffee the way she always made it, too strong, in a pot that was older than Isaiah, and she sat across from him at the table while he told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting, which was her way. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What did he say when you told him where it was?" she asked. "I haven't told him yet." She looked at him. "I wanted to ask you first," Isaiah said. Abigail set down her coffee cup. She looked at the window, at the light coming through the curtains she had hung herself when Isaiah's mother was 4 years old. She was quiet for long enough that Isaiah started to think she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, "Harold came here because he didn't know where else to go. I kept it because I said I would, but I am not the person it was meant to find. I never was." She stood up. She went to the bedroom. She came back with the cedar trunk, which was lighter than it looked, and she set it on the table between them. Inside, wrapped in the same blanket that Bessie had used in 1931, faded now, but intact, was the violin. Isaiah had seen it before. He had held it once, when he was 14, while his grandmother watched. He had never played it. He was not a musician, and it had never felt like his to play. He looked at it now. It was old in the way that things are old when they have been cared for, not deteriorated, but settled into itself, the way a person settles into themselves when they have been given time and attention and something worth doing. The varnish was the deep amber of real age. The wood had the particular warmth of something that had been handled by human hands for a long time. He thought about Elias Sorrow, who had been a free man in a city that was still deciding what freedom meant, who had learned a craft from someone who taught him, and then done something with it that his teacher had not, who had made 11 instruments and left them in the world, like a message he wasn't sure anyone would receive. He thought about Bessie, whose last name he did not know, who had taken a thing pressed into her hands by a weeping man and understood, without being told in so many words, that it mattered. He thought about his grandmother, who had kept a secret for 31 years in a cedar trunk under a bed in a house with a tilted porch, not because she wanted to keep it, but because keeping it was what the moment had asked of her. He closed the trunk carefully. "Okay," he said. The legal process took 4 months. Hargrove, to his credit, and this is genuinely to his credit, in a way that cost him something, cooperated with it. He had, in the meantime, returned the purchase price to the estate dealer and initiated a separate inquiry into the forgery's origin, which was a thing he could have avoided doing and chose not to. He hired an attorney to facilitate the return of the real instrument to the surviving members of the Calloway family, who were located, eventually, in 3 different states. There was a ceremony of sorts, though ceremony is perhaps too large a word for what it was. A meeting in a community center in New Orleans with a dozen people who were connected to the Calloway name by blood and history and the particular bond that forms when a family has shared something for long enough. Some of them had not known the violin existed. Some of them had heard the story from grandparents and assumed it was the kind of story families tell. Half true, probably, embroidered by time. Dr. Okafor played it. She played something slow and without a name, something she said she had composed on the drive down, or rather that had come to her on the drive down, which is a different thing. The room listened in the way rooms listen when something is being given back that was thought to be lost. Isaiah sat in the back. He had not been asked to speak. He had not asked to speak. A woman named Carlotta, who was 81 and had been a girl when her grandfather talked about the violin, sat in the front row and cried quietly and without any apparent embarrassment. The way old women sometimes cry when something they had stopped expecting to happen, happens. When it was over, she made her way to the back of the room and found Isaiah. She said, "How did you know?" He thought about how to answer that. He thought about 8 years of reading. He thought about a lumberyard in Mississippi and a community college course and 40 minutes in front of a different violin in a university in Nashville. He thought about his grandmother's voice saying, it sounded like something that had been waiting. "I just paid attention," he said, "for a long time, to something that most people decided wasn't worth their time." Carlotta looked at him. "That's not nothing," she said. "No, ma'am," he said, "it's not." Reginald Hargrove sent Isaiah a letter 3 weeks later. Not an email, a letter, handwritten, on the kind of paper that indicates someone has thought about what they are doing. It said, among other things, that he had been wrong, and that being wrong in the way he had been wrong was not simply a matter of facts, but a matter of how he had looked at a person and decided in under 10 seconds what that person was capable of. He offered Isaiah a position, a consultancy, formally structured, well compensated, to assist in the authentication of estate instruments. Isaiah accepted. He drove to Nashville on a Tuesday in August and sat in the Hargrove offices for the first time as something other than an intrusion. The chairs in the waiting room were the kind that cost more than his car. The receptionist brought him water without being asked. The view from the conference room window showed the city doing what cities do in August, shimmering, a little miserable, full of itself in a way that was somehow charming. Hargrove came in and extended his hand. Isaiah shook it. There was a brief, functional pause, the kind that exists between two people who know something happened between them and have agreed, for practical purposes, to move forward from it. "There's an estate out of Savannah," Hargrove said. 19th century brass instruments, some strings. "The documentation is," he paused, uncertain. Isaiah said, "I'll take a look." He said it simply, without performance. He had not come there to make a point, or to be seen making a point, or to let anyone in the room understand that he was aware he had earned this. That was not the thing. The thing was the work. The thing had always been the work. The decades of practice it took to understand a piece of wood well enough to hear what it was saying. The particular quality of attention that most people mistake for luck, because they have never tried to sustain it long enough to know what it actually is. Elias Sorrow had known. He had sat in a room in New Orleans in 1887 and made something with his hands that was still, 138 years later, capable of filling a room with sound that made an 81-year-old woman weep in the front row. That was not luck. That was not accident. That was a man who paid attention, for a long time, to something most people had decided wasn't worth their time. Some things wait to be found by the right person. Some things are patient in a way that people rarely are. And sometimes the person they are waiting for shows up in a canvas jacket with mud on their boots and $43 in their wallet, and a clarity about what they know that no room full of chandeliers and heavy catalog paper can diminish. The broken do not fear the unbreakable. They are often the only ones who understand it.